So in the wake of the attacks in France in mid-November 2015, it gives us an opportunity to really reflect on immigration integration in the European context. Now we can categorize immigrants into skilled and unskilled sort of categories. For unskilled migrants, they're generally concentrated in jobs that do not require full language fluency, such as manual jobs, cultural knowledge, or local experience. European data shows that they tend to have worse jobs in what sociologists call low status and low paying sort of work. They generally work in catering and hotel industries, agriculture, transport, and the sort of sectors that surround this sort of general working categories. Their unemployment tends to be a bit higher as well, but this varies by European nation. But the general trend is that their unemployment rate is much higher. In addition, newly arrived unskilled migrants are competing with previous immigrants and generally not native-born workers for such jobs. So basically what we see in this context, notably in the European context, is that state intervention is needed to help unskilled migrants face barriers and combat barriers to labor market access. They need to have greater language courses and promoting training that can actually allow them to access these particular sort of higher positions, higher paying positions, that is. Now, as I said, there's unskilled workers and there's also skilled workers who migrate to Europe. And for the skilled workers, they're more internationally mobile, but they are a small cohort. Highly qualified migrants can bring new entrepreneurial sort of spirit, and they can contribute to the local economies. They can contribute to complementing native skills, stimulating specialization, and innovation and technological progress. If highly educated are likely to contribute to entrepreneurship, we see that there might be a brain gain, or what sociologists would call a brain gain. They're able to improve opportunities for local native-born, so to speak. So we have unskilled migrants, skilled migrants. What's really fascinating, however, is looking at their offspring, their children. And so what we basically have been looking at is the first generation migrants coming to Europe. The second generation of migrants coming to Europe, however, face what I call ethnic penalties. And this is something that we see in the UK context, the French context, and the German context. Well, notably for visible ethnic minorities, if you look at their comparable educational levels to native-born, they are actually not getting the same returns to education. What that means is, if they have the same education as a native-born, you find that they're not getting the same incomes when they get a job as native-borns are. And so this is what I call this ethnic penalty, and it's something that's afflicting the second-generation immigrant population. So why does this occur? And I think that's a key question to understand policy prescriptions. Well, let's be blunt about this. Basically, we can say it's potentially discrimination. This is generally the first thing that comes to mind. And when it comes to employment, it often requires the employer and the employee to have a mutual trust in each other. So there might be a role of discrimination here when there isn't that mutual trust. I'll talk more about trust in a moment. But it's not only discrimination. In fact, my research suggests it's very little to do with discrimination. It has more to do with an individual social network, a firm's working culture, and a community's social trust. So an individual social network. Basically what we see is that the second generation migrants to Europe do not have the same quality of networks as native-born. In other words, there's things called strong ties and weak ties. Strong ties are family ties, or close friend ties. Weak ties are acquaintances. And the best job information, the best ways to acquire a job is to actually have greater weak ties. What we see is that the second generation visible minorities in Europe tend to have more strong ties than weak ties. Conversely, what we find is that native-borns tend to have more weak ties than strong ties. 2/3 of all jobs are found through weak ties. And so as a consequence, what we see is that migrants and their offspring are at a disadvantage because they do not have the same networks. Another sort of a reason why this occurs, why this sort of ethnic penalty occurs in Europe, is due to a firm's working culture. During the hiring process, what you find is that employers tend to want to see a fit between the employer and the employee. And so if they can fit within the working culture, if they can fit within the way the firm operates, And often an employer perceives, because they have very little interaction with a lot of the visible ethnic minority groups, they don't trust them as much. And so they perceive that there isn't a fit. So a lot of it has to do with trust. As a corollary of this, we can say a community social trust plays a role. What we see is that Native populations and the immigrant populations do not meaningfully interact with each other as much. And as such, if they don't meaningfully interact, they don't trust each other as much. And as I've been suggesting to you, trust plays such a strong role in employment. In spite of your education, in spite of your human capital, it plays such a strong role that if there isn't that minimal level of trust at the individual or community level, you're not going to see returns to your education. So these are the reasons why I suggest to you that it has something to do with discrimination, but it only plays a small role. It has a lot to do, again, with networks. It has a lot to do with firms' working culture and a community's trust. Now, this situation becomes cyclical. So you have a high education, or you have comparable education to the native born, and you find that you're not getting that same job as the native born. You're not getting the same wages. Well, wages become a proxy for where you live. So for instance, if I earn $100, I'm going to live in a community where other people earn $100. And conversely, if I earn $1,000, I'm going to live in a community where people earn $1,000. And so as we see, if a migrant or second generation migrant earns $100, you're more likely to interact with that community. And so we've been talking about trust. If you live in a similar community as another individual, you're more likely to trust them. And so it becomes a cyclical process. When you have ethnic penalties, it reduces community interactions because of the geography. Another sort of thing to suggest here is, what should we do about this? So we've suggested there's unskilled, skilled migrants. We said their second generation are suffering penalties in the labor market, particularly in Germany, France, and the UK. Well, this is important for integration. Ultimately, it's in the interests of the state to ensure that penalties are reduced because they're investing so much in education. So from an investment standpoint, if you're investing the same number of education dollars into a student, you're not getting the same returns when they get to the labor market because some are earning more than others. So that should be an affront to the state. And so it's a motivating factor for the state to actually attempt to curb this sort of reality. But getting back to the sort of context we saw in France and the sort of attacks that occurred, what this might suggest is if we have this continuing sort of ethnic penalties, it can lead potentially to a rise of ethno-religious consciousness and potentially to flash ethnic violence. We've seen this reality in other jurisdictions. Flash ethnic violence usually occurs when there's a low socioeconomic scores or low SES scores and a lack of institutional access. Now, we've touched on the low SES scores because we've seen that the second generation are not doing as well as native born are. Their expectations are not being met. And so what happens as a reality is that they turn more into their ethnicity. They become more acutely aware of their ethnicity. And if their ethnicity has a religious component, you find that they're more likely to turn to an ethno-religious consciousness. They're more likely to have heightened ethno-religious consciousness, which can be converted into potential ethnic violence. So in the short, what we're seeing here is that it's a very long process of why these acts occur. It's not simply an act occurring out of randomness. There's a strong economic dimension to this, and what I suggested in this particular sort of conversation we're having has a lot to do with ethnic penalties for the second generation.